In this video, I am going to discuss some positions on the nature of moral standing. In particular, I will focus on two questions. First, what kinds of things have moral standing? And second, in virtue of what exactly do things have it? To say that something has moral standing means that it is the kind of thing that moral agents are required to give moral consideration, care, or concern. However, we can further distinguish between two kinds of moral standing. Sometimes moral standing is indirect. This means that we are only required to give care, consideration, and concern to things due to certain relations we bear to those things. Other times, moral consideration will be direct. This means we are required to give things consideration, care, or concern, regardless of any relations we bear to those things. Here is an example that might help illustrate the difference. Suppose while you are at work, you are having a lot of problems with your work computer, and no one at work seems to be able to help you. Eventually, you become so frustrated that in a fit of rage, you throw your company's computer out the window. Would you be doing something wrong by throwing your company's computer out the window? It seems clear that you would be, but why exactly? It is true that you ought to show consideration, care, and concern towards your employer's property, but that is only because that is what is required of you to show consideration, care, and concern towards your employer. It is not wrong to throw the computer out the window because of any intrinsic moral features that the computer actually possesses. Pieces of property are not the kinds of things that can be directly violated, and hence they do not have any direct moral standing. So in this case, the computer would only have some type of indirect moral standing. You are concerned with not violating your employer, and by misusing your employer's property, you would be violating your employer. Now let us turn our attention to views on direct moral standing. The first view of direct moral standing is known as anthropocentrism. According to the anthropocentrist, only human beings, or things that are rationally equivalent to human beings, have direct moral standing. Typically, anthropocentrists understand human beings as autonomous rational agents, which is why we are required to show fellow human beings moral consideration, care, and concern. However, this does not necessarily only extend to human beings. For example, if we discovered a species of alien that also had the capacity for rational autonomy that is equivalent to our own, then on anthropocentric grounds, those alien beings would be our moral equals. For the anthropocentrist, it is not our status as Homo sapiens that is doing the explanatory work, but rather the type of rational nature Homo sapiens typically have that is doing the explanatory work. The anthropocentrist does get something right by emphasizing the importance of rational autonomy, but is that really the full picture? For example, let's say that every day when I come home from work, my neighbor's dog starts barking incessantly. One day I have enough of this, and I decide to put some poisoned dog food in my neighbor's backyard in order to kill their dog. Can we explain why such an action would be wrong on anthropocentric grounds? It seems that we can. By poisoning the dog, I am violating my neighbor. My neighbor cares very deeply about the dog and cherishes the dog, so it is out of respect for my neighbor that I ought not to poison their dog. Notice here that according to the anthropocentrist, the dog does not have any direct moral standing. So, poisoning my neighbor's dog would be wrong for the same reason that throwing the computer out the window would be. Let's change the scenario a bit and see what the anthropocentrist might say. Suppose that there is a wild fox that sometimes wanders around my property. The fox is not a nuisance to anyone, but it's also the case that neither I nor anyone else particularly cares for the fox or has any strong feelings towards it. I decide to put a bowl of poisoned dog food outside to kill the fox. Can an anthropocentrist explain why this sort of action would be wrong? It doesn't appear that the anthropocentrist can. In poisoning the fox, I would not be directly violating any fellow human beings. Now, one might try to say that I somehow violate myself by poisoning the fox, but the wrongdoing would once again not be explained by any direct moral standing that the fox has. Now, if it would be wrong to poison the fox, independently of any impact that this has on any human being, then anthropocentrism has to be false. A more promising position on moral standing would be some type of sentiocentrism. We can define sentiocentrism as the position that anything that is capable of feeling pain or experiencing suffering has direct moral standing. So, on sentiocentric grounds, not only do I have direct obligations towards my neighbor's dog and the fox, but I also have direct obligations to the sorts of animals that human beings typically use as a food source as well. Here someone may ask why sentience makes a moral difference. Why should we think that anything that can feel pain or experience suffering has direct moral standing? One reason in favor of this position is that being in pain is an intrinsically bad state of affairs. Being in a state of pain is not bad because of some other state that is associated with being in pain. The badness of pain is explained in itself. Another reason in favor of sentience making a moral difference is the fact that inflicting pain requires moral justification. Being in pain and inflicting pain may be morally justified by overriding moral reasons, but since inflicting pain requires moral justification, this would mean that inflicting pain is generally wrong. But if inflicting pain is generally wrong, anything capable of feeling pain is the kind of thing that can be wronged. The last view of moral standing I will discuss here is biocentrism. Biocentrism is the position that anything that is biologically alive has moral standing. On biocentric grounds, not only would fellow human beings and non-human animals be the sorts of things that have direct obligations towards, but so are plants and insects. Some biocentrists say that entire natural habitats and ecosystems are the sorts of things that we have direct obligations towards as well. So what reasons are there in favor of biocentrism? First of all, every living thing has conditions of its flourishing that can either be furthered or frustrated by the activities of moral agents. Frustrating the conditions of a living thing's flourishing is to harm it, and causing harm is the kind of thing that requires moral justification. Since causing harm requires moral justification, it is generally wrong to cause harm. But if it's generally wrong to cause harm, this means that anything that is capable of being harmed is the kind of thing that we can directly wrong. Now, despite those three positions on moral standing, another concern is the degree of moral consideration, care, or concern that we ought to give with beings with moral standing. So here we can distinguish between egalitarian approaches and non-egalitarian approaches. Egalitarianism is the position that anything with direct moral standing ought to be given equal consideration, care, or concern. Non-egalitarianism is the position that it is not the case that everything with moral standing ought to be given equal consideration, care, or concern. Individuals who defend egalitarianism typically say that any grounds on which we say things ought to be given different degrees of consideration is going to be arbitrary. And as such, all versions of non-egalitarianism are arbitrary. Is this really the case, though? For example, let's say that you find yourself in a house that is on fire, and you have to decide between saving a baby, a cat, or a houseplant. You can only save one. If you are a biocentric egalitarian, then you owe the baby, the cat, and the houseplant equal consideration. So if you are forced to only save one, it really doesn't matter which one you save. Any decision to save one over the other is going to be completely arbitrary. So maybe you should settle which one to save with a series of coin flips. If you think that this would not be the right approach to take, then you would probably find this type of egalitarianism problematic. So, how could we possibly justify a non-egalitarian perspective? Even if it is true that the biocentrist is correct in saying that every living thing ought to be given some direct consideration, it doesn't follow that every living thing ought to be given equal consideration. It seems reasonable to say that the degree of consideration that we are required to give a certain thing is determined by the unique ways in which that thing can be violated or wronged. We certainly can violate plants by uprooting them from the ground for no morally overriding reason, and we may even violate natural ecosystems and habitats by depleting them and polluting them. But can plants and ecosystems be the victims of unjust laws or policies? Can plants, insects, and non-human animals be the victims of marginalization or oppression? Can they be made to feel as if society has no place for them and that they are not a valued member of society? It does not appear to be so. But fellow human beings can be the victims of marginalization and oppression and can be made to feel as if they are not a valued member of society. So we can violate fellow human beings in ways that we cannot violate plants, insects, and non-human animals. So, although an entity's direct moral standing is not determined by any relations we bear to it, the ways in which we can violate an entity is partially determined by the relations we bear to it. I can violate my children by lying to them, but I cannot lie to my cat. I do nothing wrong by refraining from buying birthday presents for complete strangers' children, but I would be doing something wrong by refraining from buying birthday presents for my own children. Now, it is likewise the case that the existence of social, political, and economic conditions partially determines the unique ways in which we can violate others. Social, political, and economic conditions are relevant to human individuals' flourishing, and as such, make members of certain populations particularly vulnerable to kinds of harms and violations. If I know that one individual is particularly vulnerable compared to another in virtue of being a member of a certain social demographic, then I need to take that vulnerability into consideration. If there are systemic barriers to flourishing that disproportionately impact certain members of our society, then we fail to give members of society the full consideration we ought to give them if we do not act to correct those barriers.